I am back in a hotel here this morning on Thursday. I was in Tampa, Florida on Tuesday. Today, I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, where it's a little bit before 6 a.m. Central Time. And unlike in Florida, there is absolutely no twilight. I mean, it's completely nighttime here, probably because I'm kind of on the western edge of that central time zone right now. However, I did get lucky this week as far as hotel rooms. I don't have like the window units. There's been central air, and so I don't have that like fan that's ready to interject in the video in the morning when Eric and I record these. So you shouldn't hear anything, although we did have a fire alarm last night and the building was evacuated, so that's a first for me at a hotel. That was kind of fun, but seemed to be a false alarm they got us in right away. But anyway, did get some sleep despite that, and looking at the weather here this morning, first thing I want to mention is the trough off the west coast of the United States. Not only are we dealing with that and the low pressure system that's formed with that just west of California, that's bringing some rain showers, winter storm warnings to California along with some wind advisories, but we are loaded up, especially in California, for additional storm systems. And then it's going to kind of work its way south in a number of these as well, and I think Southern California, portions of Arizona are going to get in on this precipitation as well. So if we kind of point that out, obviously we can see this deeper trough here just west of San Francisco. That's bringing rain showers and wind in here this morning. Ridge just behind that, but if you look closely, it's kind of hard to see, but there's these little first off, there's this long wave trough just behind this ridge north of California, but there's these little jet streaks or shortwave troughs embedded in this flow, and those are just going to ride up and over this ridge over the coming days into this weekend. We're expecting another piece to come into the west coast of the U.S., and then way back to the west, almost over like Hokkaido, Japan. There's another trough here, with a pretty decent jet streak associated with it, and that's going to make its way over next week, and that's actually going to be a pretty significant weather maker, not only for the west coast as that cuts across the southwest and the Four Corners, but ultimately could yield a severe weather threat across the mid-south or the southern U.S. as we look out into that forecast. We'll talk about all that. I do want to jump over and show you the current infrared satellite imagery across the eastern Pacific, get a good view of what we were just talking about, that ridge, first of all, north of Hawaii, which is just barely on this map. I think that's Kauai there, the most northern island. But there's that trough there just west of California, bringing the clouds, the rainfall into the northern portion of the state here, starting to get into like the Central Valley. If we jump over and look at the radar here this morning, you can see rain showers getting all the way into the Central Valley. So just starting to fall here now in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and then some getting up into the Seattle, Tacoma area. Unfortunately, we'll talk about this in a minute. I'll kind of just jump ahead and show you the forecasted rainfall. We're starting to see a little bit of a split in the flow, especially as these systems come through, where quite a bit of activity in like the northern Pacific Northwest, up in Washington, British Columbia. See high rainfall values there, in excess of an inch. But the Willamette Valley, the Cascades, kind of missing out on the, best axis for moisture and precipitation with some of these kind of, not only where the lows position, but where the moisture source and the atmospheric rivers coming in. A lot of that focusing on California, if not Southern California. We're seeing impressive rain values here. Slight risk for flooding exists 3 days in a row. So when you start stacking up slight risks, you're increasing the overall risk, if you will, for Southern California. And there's some burn scars in here as well, obviously from wildfires this year, both late in the year, but then obviously going back to January with the Pacific Palisades fire. So keep an eye on Southern California as these systems make their way through. Now, otherwise, if we look at the all hazards map here this morning, let's reset this, make this valid about 6 a.m. Winter storm warnings out for the Southern Sierras. It extends all the way up into Central California here. See these flood watches along the foothills like Placerville, California, areas just east of Fresno, and then wind advisories in that kind of beige color along the coast, and then even into the Sacramento Valley as well. High wind warning up in Montana, one here in southern Oregon, as well as these kind of systems materialize and then cut across the Rockies, expecting pretty high winds here. We'll look at those a little bit later in the video. As I was mentioning, east of the Continental Divide, not too much to talk about. Obviously, rainfall in the forecast, we just kind of peeked at that. Coming up through the Mid-South, some of this likely to get into the Corn Belt. But it's not very much over the next 7 days. We're kind of waiting for this pattern to fully shift into this, deeper West Coast troughing. They're getting the brunt of those systems right now, but as that trough axis shifts from here, kind of where it's going over the next 5 days, to here, we're waiting for that translation to help produce that better southwest flow over this corridor here, even getting into the plains as well, where some pretty high confidence for heavier precipitation is on the way for mid to late November. Now let's put this all together. I want to jump over and show you that 500 millibar height forecast, because that shows us this trough that we were just talking about here. There's that, let's call that the Hawaiian Ridge, kind of between Alaska and Hawaii. Eric was talking about that yesterday, how important that can be for wintertime forecast. Taking the forecast forward now through Friday, we see this trough here starting to cut off and then move further south. So the rainfall will be increasing through the next 24 hours for Southern California. See another system cutting across the Canadian border into New England. Expecting precipitation here this weekend as that cuts through colder temperatures, snowfall for New England, especially at the higher elevations. Looking at some snowfall there. And there's that next piece. It's almost hard to see, so I was kind of focusing on New England, but that, remember, I showed you this at the beginning, that little jet streak sneaking through up and over the ridge, finding its way back into the western U.S., bringing more rain Sunday and Monday, particularly to the Pacific Northwest, but also California. That cuts through, starts to live in the Four Corners region for a bit early next week, and then there's that third system making its way down on Wednesday. We're talking November 19th at this point. All the while, ridging has been trying to settle into the central and eastern U.S., so warming up this weekend, warming up for the southeast, and then ultimately later in the 7-day forecast, warming up for the east coast of the United States and New England as well. That second system dives through from the ECWF. This is late next week, now Thursday. Saw that initial one move through the Midwest, bringing showers, precipitation, maybe some severe chances for the Mid-South. And this one sets up somewhere in Texas, Saturday, November 22nd. And the rainfall values are going to be increasing substantially as we go further out into the forecast. So you get from Thursday to Friday of next week, then Saturday, and then I think it could be gangbusters for much of the central portion of the country. And it's kind of funny. If you look at the forecast, I was doing this morning. I was kind of playing it back and forth. I'm not going to focus on anything too specifically. We do have flow through the continental U.S. First off, this weekend I mentioned the system cutting across Canadian prairie, diving down into New England. We'll get that precipitation in a second. Let's see if I have that pulled up. Not yet. We'll get to it in a moment. We have this trough here, obviously, that we're talking about this weekend. This one kind of cut off. This is that initial one that we were just looking at. That sneaks up through the central plain. Unfortunately, kind of just gets absorbed into the flow, but maybe some light showers associated with that, but not a ton, right? Over the central plains, talking maybe like 0.2 of an inch. Okay, that second trough comes in Wednesday, Thursday. That cuts across Thursday, expecting some rainfall with that one, but you'll notice that one didn't, dig and dive through the eastern U.S. as well. And it's this one that we're really kind of waiting for. I just mentioned that Thursday, Friday, Saturday, when we're transitioning into that better precipitation mode for the central and eastern U.S. And you might be asking, well, what makes this trough so special? Because it doesn't look, it's not one of these deep, long wave troughs that's connected to the broader flow. You can see it's essentially cut off from the broader jet stream flow to the north. Well, the difference here is actually not the trough. What we've been kind of ignoring, or what I've been ignoring in this forecast, is this subtropical high, this ridging over Virginia and North Carolina. This is actually the reason that a lot of these forecasts have gone over so wet. I'm just going to jump over. I haven't even looked at this map this morning. I know it's going to be wet for the central U.S. Yeah, the 8 to 14 day outlook. Wet for the central U.S. High confidence in this forecast at this point. And the reason is it's that Bermuda high. It's finally coming back. It's been weaker for quite a while this fall. As a result, the last 30 days of precipitation have been lacking for a number of areas east of the Continental Divide. But we need that Bermuda high to come back. And if I can find the part of the slide deck here where I put that, there we go. All right, let's follow this. This is the 850 millibar winds. If we look now, how it is this morning, 6 a.m. Central, literally it's 6:02 a.m. Central Time, so pretty good. There's that low that we're tracking west of California. You can kind of even see that ridge, that high pressure system north of Hawaii. That next jet streak is kind of visible at 850. It's kind of fun. 850 kind of right in the low to mid levels. You start seeing both features, both the surface level, low pressure system here, but you can kind of see the effects of that jet streak and cold front there. But if you look over to the Bermuda high, it's a Bermuda trough. So that's not very efficient at pumping moisture into the central U.S., which is why these initial systems that come off out of the west are pretty lacking in terms of shower and precipitation coverage. But I'm going to play this forecast quickly. And by Sunday, Monday, we have an even deeper Bermuda trough. There's this deep low here over like Nova Scotia. So again, here comes more systems early next week. There's that one that we talked about earlier coming off. We're going to get some rainfall out of this. But again, you'll notice, Matt, all those systems coming through. Where's the rainfall? Well, we're shoving all the moisture south and east. And again, if you look at the southeast, bone dry through the 7-day forecast. All right. That takes us to November 18th. Matt said, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, we're really going to see this thing kick into high gear. By Wednesday, we have that third system. I said, that one's starting to look a little better. Okay, now we have a Jacksonville high, and we still kind of have a Bermuda low / weak trough here. So that's improving a bit. by Wednesday of next week. At least we have, you could draw some flow around these contours up into the central U.S. from more moisture source regions. So start improving that on Thursday. Okay, now ultimately by Thursday, Friday, we almost have our Bermuda high all the way back here. And actually looks, like a decently west positioned one as that low wraps up in the middle part of the country on Friday. So now Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Bermuda high coming back, deep low coming through the central part of the country, and it sticks around. Here comes that next trough by Saturday. Remember, this one looked a little bit weaker, but it's got, a full 2 or 3 days of the Bermuda high just pumping moisture in before it comes through. So even if it's weaker, it's going to have plenty of moisture. And frankly, sometimes these weaker troughs, the ones that are cut off, they move a little bit slower. So you're increasing the residency time of the rainfall. I mentioned just earlier, 3 days of slight risks in a row can be problematic. And if this trough's just going to sit here and bring, moderate rainfall for multiple days in a row over the same areas, that certainly can add up to be more significant flooding, despite being a cutoff low. So that's kind of the story we're watching later next week as this Bermuda high gets going. We can see this if we look at let's do the 7-day. First of all, here's the 5-day precipitation anomaly. This is from the latest ECMWF. Again, relatively drier through the weekend for the central and eastern part of the country, despite these systems cutting across at various times. That one over the Central Plains, we talked about the one over New England, certainly Southern California getting plenty of precipitation out of this. If we take it to 7 days, those initial systems start cutting through the Midwest. This takes us all the way out to Thursday of next week, roughly to the morning. Again, not terribly impressive. Canadian Prairie getting on some of this rainfall and snow as well. And then if we look at 4 to 10 days, now we're really opening it up because we're now including Thursday through Saturday in the forecast time period at this point. And if we go to 10 days, kind of put it all together. Now, again, there's 2 areas on this map I'm concerned about. I've mentioned both of them up to this point, the Willamette Valley, even getting into the Seattle-Tacoma area. There will be precipitation coming through, but this is a time of year they get a lot of it. So looking at negative precipitation anomalies. The other area, that Bermuda high is both strong, and I mentioned it has that kind of westward position. What I mean by that is it wasn't centered necessarily right over Bermuda, that little speck here. It was kind of centered just off the east coast of the Carolinas. And as it does that, it always starts to cut off the precipitation at some point, a little bit further toward the southeast. And this is an area we're worried about this winter. There's quite a few differences in some of these different seasonal outlooks that we look at for this winter, but they all have mostly one thing in common, that this area is likely to stay drier through February. A lot of them have started to shift over wetter for the southern Mississippi Valley, like through Memphis, western Kentucky, down through the Gulf Coast. This area has gone wetter, and it's gone wetter in the long-range forecast as well, just looking at 8 to 30 days. But this area has not. It's stayed dry in a lot of these long-range forecasts, and it's dry here in the 10-day forecast. And it's dry looking back. In fact, if we look at the drought monitor, and I'm not even going to look at the latest one. I don't think it's updated yet as of this morning. But sometimes, frankly, I don't look at the drought monitor start. I look at the change of the drought monitor, the derivative, if you will. And if you look at the last 8 weeks of how those drought classifications have changed across the continental U.S., well, the area that's been increasing in drought categories the fastest has been that corridor in the southeast, Georgia, North Florida, far eastern Alabama, and then the Carolinas as well. So watching this area, not only through the next 10 days for lack of precipitation, but we've been seeing the dryness occur over the last 30 to 60, and a number of these seasonal forecasts suggest that, unfortunately, that could continue. Now, I mentioned Memphis, the southern Mississippi Valley, been removing drought classifications there despite a broader trend of increased dryness across the eastern continental U.S. I want to jump over and compare the ECMWF to the GFS because early on in the forecast, as expected, there's quite a few similarities. So seeing that precipitation coverage pick up through the weekend for Southern California, that initial system kind of wraps up into the Central Plains. There's another piece of it trying to get into the Midwest early next week. There's that next system that cuts through California. You're going to notice the ECMWF now, as I take this all the way to Tuesday of next week, is going to be moving these systems through a little bit quicker. GFS still kind of backed up into the Four Corners, the ECMWF getting that moisture return all the way up into the Corn Belt, Missouri by Wednesday of next week. By Thursday, ECMWF really wrapping that low up, and we have precipitation coverage from Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, all the way down through Texas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, even into central and west Texas. And the GFS just a little bit slower by Thursday, keeping that system a little bit more consolidated back toward the west, kind of close to me where I'm at now in Omaha, Nebraska. And then the ECMWF quicker with that third west system. Look at the snow levels finally dropping as these subsequent systems come through. They bring down the snow levels a bit as that trough starts to center more so over the western U.S. rather than just off the coastline, and increased snowpack coming for the Sierra Nevadas and portions of the western U.S. But both systems bringing a lot of rain through the central part of the country now. By Thursday of next week, remember that's there's that Bermuda high. It's coming back. We're starting to get that better flow. And this is a period like Thursday, Friday next week. We have to keep an eye on some severe weather in here. I don't think it's going to be too significant, but we always have one or two lows, typically these deep lows in late October or late November, that just gets enough of those ingredients overlapping somewhere in the Mid-South to produce a decent severe setup. And that might be on its way next week. We'll have to keep an eye on that. I know Andrew will be focused on that as we work through the forecast here this weekend. The West still seeing activity even late next week. I'm going to play this forecast forward. Remember, from the ECMWF, we had that cutoff low here Saturday with plenty of moisture out ahead of it from the Bermuda high. That's perfectly over Bermuda now. That just works out really well. GFS a little bit weaker with that Bermuda high and then a little bit less organized with that system, but still plenty of flow coming in behind it from the GFS with yet another system. The GFS still plenty wet in the long-range forecast, as is the ECMWF, with some slight differences now on where the position of that potentially fourth California storm is. So plenty of rain coming for the west, and then improving rainfall situation for the central and eastern part of the country, especially up into the Corn Belt and the Midwest. But some lacking precipitation concerns continue for the southeast, obviously. I did kind of gloss over snow quickly. Plenty coming for the Sierra Nevadas. It's off our color bar, which goes all the way up to almost 3 feet of snow, if not more. So plenty of snow coming for the Sierra Nevadas. Less for the Cascades. I know we're up into the foot territory here, but they could do a lot better in late November. Plenty coming for Canada and the Canadian Rockies, and then the U.S. Rockies. Decent snowpack here to start the year, especially in November, with room for improvement as we go along. Not too concerned about the water situation in California. I know Eric showed the snowfall departure map, and California didn't look very impressive because the snow levels have been high, with that trough kind of positioned, I mentioned, this way rather than this way. The snow levels have been a little bit higher out in front of some of the flow, but what we have had is just precip, and that still helps. That still gets into some of these lower reservoirs. And just for example, again, Placerville I mentioned earlier, in the foothills of the Sierras, going through summer, they don't get much rainfall, historically, typically flatlining, and they've had a decent start to the water year. Not above average yet, but look at their forecast, expected to jump above average by late November, just in accumulated precip. A lot of this is just rainfall. Placerville's not too high up, and that moisture still matters getting into the hydrology and the soils there. So not too worried about California yet. Obviously, the seasonal forecast right now with La Nina in the background is going to pose some issues, but with maybe an El Nino transition early next spring, some of our California concerns aren't as strong as they were. That's not to say they're out of the woods with respect to moisture yet, but it's one of those things until we see that forecast shift dry for them, which it was just about the opposite of that in the 7 to 10 days. I'm not going to be too worried about it. Not to mention they've been removing drought classifications over there through the last 8 weeks. Temperature-wise, I'm going to do this quickly because we've been talking about this story for a while. I just wanted to mention the warmth tomorrow coming for the northern plains. 70s up in Nebraska and the Dakotas, if not the mid-60s. 60s over toward the Twin Cities, and then 70s getting into the central U.S. with 80s through Texas and some of the Gulf Coast states. That continues on Saturday. Impressive warmth against 70s in Illinois, 83 in Oklahoma City, talking like mid-80s in northern Texas. This is an impressive mid-November warm-up behind that colder air that we saw over the last 7 days. And then finally that's spreading all the way over to the Atlantic coastline. And then in the long range, looking out Wednesday with that Bermuda high picking up. I know we kind of returned seasonal with some of these systems coming through the clouds, the rain and the wind will be felt, but with moisture picking back up, the warmth and the return out of the Gulf is going to be increasing. So we're kind of waiting in the eastern continental U.S. for a cold shot now that's, we think, likely to come in early December, if not late November, but we're going to be warm in the meantime. And the good news is we'll be wet for the soils going in through winter. The west stays cool naturally with a lot of that activity coming through. Now, a bigger story that Eric and I have been talking about, and we're going to cover this more extensively over the next, let's call it the next 2 to 3 videos here through the weekend, then early next week, is this sudden stratospheric warming event. Talking about for about a week now, and I've shown you this graphic a few times. This is looking at the strength of the polar vortex this year in red and then pink in the more recent days here through October and early November. And then this orange line is the forecast. So we're here in like early November, but if I take this forecast out into mid-November, that polar vortex strength, which is what's being plotted here, at least this year versus historical, blue is 2024, 2025. We're seeing a big drop off in polar vortex strength going through late November. And we know that tends to correlate, a week to 3 weeks after with big cold air outbreaks into the U.S., typically the central and then the eastern U.S. thereafter that. And we saw some of that last year in 24, 25 work out nicely, and we're seeing it this year. That sudden stratospheric warming event is going to be, I'll say this, as it's forecasted now, in the 10 to 15 day range, would be arguably the strongest SSW or stratospheric warming event on record. And it's kind of easy to showcase this if I just show you the stratosphere. We have 10 millibar heights. We're way up. We're like where the aurora has been at this point, and way aloft in the atmosphere above where planes fly. And we know this can influence the weather downstream as the changes in these so-called troughs and ridges, the polar vortex disruptions propagate from the upper levels of the atmosphere into the lower levels where we're living and trying to forecast the weather. That's a mouthful. Let's just put this all together. Let's play the forecast. Here's the polar vortex currently. It's kind of situated more so over Siberia. It's starting to get shoved a little bit in this direction, maybe a slight split here. And if we look at our graphic, where we're at now, we're actually already into the weakening process of this a bit. So we've dropped below average. That makes sense. This doesn't look like a great polar vortex right now, but it's still kind of coherent. There's still this central trough close to the North Pole. I'm going to play this forecast forward through this weekend, through next week, now into next weekend. So going way out in the forecast. I mentioned kind of late November, 18th, 19th. Now getting into that next week, the 2-week time period, and then ultimately all the way out to November 27th. Now, the polar vortex, which was at least at the beginning of this forecast near the North Pole, shoved all the way over towards Siberia, significantly shoved, even into like Kazakhstan or Mongolia, and it's been replaced with a ridge over the Canadian archipelago. And that's a pretty massive polar vortex disruption forecast. And it's been very consistent in these models that we're seeing one of these sudden stratospheric warming events. That's what the ridging is here. It's technically a warm air loft is going to produce the higher heights at 10 millibars. So that's why we call it a sudden stratospheric warming event. And that tends to, just put it simply, shove Arctic air out of the North Pole into the mid-latitudes, so either over Europe, somewhere in Asia, if not over the continent U.S. It's a little bit better correlated with Europe and the North American continent with respect to that scenario. We can see this in the ECMWF extended model. I'm going to play this. This is the rolling 7-day temperature average. First off, if I just take this through the 27th from the 19th, so that kind of 7-day stretch, look at how warm the surfaces of the Canadian archipelago. The same area, we saw the warmth up at 10 millibars. Again, the atmosphere is 3D and connected. And you'll notice as we get into very late November, early December, we build up that cold air in the Canadian prairie. Eric mentioned this yesterday in the video that once we get the cold air east of the Canadian Rockies, it can just follow the American Rockies or the U.S. Rockies right down into the central U.S. We're seeing that forecast start to play out. See how that plays out, like right at the end of November into the first week of December? And then the polar region stays relatively warmer through December, but the eastern U.S., first off the central Canadian prairie, then the central U.S., and then later in December, eastern U.S. staying cold. So that is the scenario being played out in the extended ECMWF weeklies. It lines up with that sudden stratospheric warming event. The exact cadence of that, is it going to funnel nicely from Canada, the cold air there initially, potentially Arctic cold air, into the central U.S. and the eastern U.S. where you're talking about potentially a significant energy event. I mean, like heating degree days and natural gas usage. It's not going to play out perfectly like this. No forecast is correct at this range, but that potential is certainly there. And I want to give a shout out to a YouTube commenter, and I forgot to pull them up. So give me a second here. I might snip the video up because I want to make sure I give them a good shout out. Okay, I pulled them up. It is Kalman Joe Drinkwalter, as the YouTube commenter, asked this great question. Hey, Eric, do you think solar flares and such influence our weather? And this was a great question. So I think I responded to this one just because I was looking at it at the time, if you don't mind. But I was talking about it with Eric. Loved the question. It got us digging. The short answer is no. Not immediately. It does impact the aurora, which if you call weather and sightseeing, yeah, it does impact that. But it's not going to, immediately warm up the ground, or like when the geomagnetic storm is, arriving and causing the aurora. It doesn't really impact any of our immediate weather. So short answer, at least shorter in the forecast, is no. But longer in the forecast, I haven't heard that question asked since like school, and I don't remember the literature or what our professor said about it. So this was a good question. It got us researching. We didn't really, frankly, know the answer to it, and doing some of the research last night on this question from that commenter was great. So we learned stuff from your comments, and then especially trying to address them. And that was a great one, so I appreciate that question. But getting into the literature, we found some interesting things from some research that has been done previously on these sudden stratospheric warming events, connecting them to geostorms, these geomagnetic storms that come through and produce the auroras that Eric takes such fantastic pictures of out of his plane. And particularly this study surprised me quite a bit, where it said, using logistic regression models. I'm going to summarize this quickly. I know I've just put up a ton of text on your screen here, and I apologize. But what I'm looking at specifically is that these sudden stratospheric warming events tend to occur when solar activity is high, and the QBO, which are those winds in the upper stratosphere that Eric and I have been mentioning all year, especially with relation to like summer drought pattern, when those winds are westerly. And that immediately caught my eye, because those two things are true right now. One, the QBO is in its westerly phase currently. We don't need to look at the QBO chart. Let's go look at the winds at 10 millibars and see if around the equator they're out of the west. Okay, here's the equator. Those winds are largely out of the west. There's a little bit of an easterly component, but that's not the equator. Following the equator, are these winds going from west to east or east to west? Well, they're west to east. Okay, we're in the QBO west phase. Check one. Solar activity. Well, I don't know if you saw Eric's video and his pictures of the aurora, or any of the other million pictures on social media over the last 2 nights of anomalous auroras visible all the way down into like New Mexico, Texas, and Alabama. But solar activity is at near peak, because we're near the peak of the solar cycle. So this variable that they mention, the F10.7 index, which is a measure of solar radiation flux from the sun, it's near the peak of its cycle. So we've checked both boxes that tend to increase sudden stratospheric warming events. So the question we can now answer in the long run is likely yes, with maybe even like an 86% confidence that this sudden stratospheric warming event that I just talked through might be connected to the geostorm. Now, interestingly, I did a deeper dive, and I said, do these models that we're tracking for the stratosphere, so like the ECMWF, the GFS, I was showing this earlier. I'm trying to jump back around. I apologize. Let's get to the I don't have it up here. Anyway, we saw in the forecast the sudden stratospheric warming event. Are the models taking into account the solar activity? And I believe the answer to that is no. Couldn't find any reliable sources that suggested that the ECMWF is assimilating like the aurora or the these CMEs that impact our upper atmosphere. So it does kind of beg the question, well, is the event being caused by the geostorm in some indirect way? What exactly is the function or the physical phenomenon happening here? And I don't have the answer to that. I would take more reading on my behalf, but you've put a lot of great questions in my mind, and love researching this stuff and trying to figure out and put it all together. So appreciate those questions, and you stump us sometimes, but that can be just as fun as anything else. All right, I took up a lot of time to kind of talk through that. I'm going to wrap it up quickly here. I had a few more slides left, just reiterating a lot of what we already talked about, namely that we're looking wetter in the long range from just virtually every model here, even the operational AIFS. We talked through the reasons for that. Keep an eye on a little bit of severe chances next week for the Mid-South. Let's keep an eye on those. Angela will continue to talk about those. They don't look impressive on the chiclets, which we show sometimes in spring, but just the fact that there's this little bump up in activity and some of these ensembles suggest the possibility is there. And then I was going to talk about the wind a little bit. California, obviously windy with these systems coming through. In northern Montana, so the high wind warnings there. Maybe some of the windiest recordings over the next 7 days of anywhere in the continental U.S., particularly in the near term. And then as those systems sweep across the Midwest, gusts up to 30s to 40s. Ultimately, it's going to be those severe thunderstorms that produce the highest gusts, if anything. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I'm at my time today, but if you made it to the end today, thanks for watching. And again, shout out to that commenter for the great question. Keep them coming.